Welcome to week 8, everybody. Great to get to this point in the course with you. I'm really sort of inspired, enthusiastic, I think, about what I'm seeing in the discussions, both the video discussions and then in the written form discussions, in terms of what you're learning, the skill that I think you're demonstrating when it comes to interpreting books of the New Testament, especially now letters, and the challenge of tracking with a thread of an argument so that these pregnant sentences or words that a lot of us have grown up hearing acquire their meaning by virtue of how they fit in the flow of particular arguments dealing with particular issues. And I think that sensibility as readers can go a long way towards a more sound use of Scripture, interpretation of Scripture, and also theological and psychological sensitivity, because we can see that these letters are concerned with highly nuanced situations and have all kinds of subtlety to them that often the way that they have been read, especially as attributed to Paul, doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound careful. It doesn't sound responsive to the particulars of people's lives. And so the skill that we're developing as readers of these texts, I think, will go a long way towards just developing capacity for a more healthy way of relating to others, not the least of whom will be clients, patients for many of you. This week we are moving into some of the more notorious letters of the Apostle Paul, Romans and Galatians, Ephesians as well. And I hope that by waiting until this point in the course to introduce these letters, you've been conditioned perhaps to be able to hear Paul's voice a little bit differently than you might have heard previously in these particular letters. So, for example, the themes that we have been already following through the letters that we've studied, from Philemon to Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, this last week with the Corinthian correspondence, the themes of a community of self-giving, where especially the powerful in the community are learning to give generously of themselves instead of clinging to positions that they have inherited in the structure of power that they're a part of. The way that the embodiment of the gospel is to be itself a proclamation of Jesus's death as this act of God's own self-giving, reflected in the way that we give ourselves to one another. Those themes are going to persist as we get into these notorious letters that often have not been interpreted really according to those themes. So going straight to the key term of justification by faith that has been so pronounced in the Protestant tradition that many of us come from, you're going to see that Paul's teaching on this concept is not primarily about an individual person's status before God, sort of in isolation, nor is it a doctrine that is used to decide who is in and who is out. It's not really a doctrine that's designed to test belonging. Instead, it's a way that Paul has of conveying the community's ability to name what God has done as a gift, the way that God has gathered us, such that we can't take any credit for it or use it as a basis by which to keep people away or keep people down, you might say, but instead are open to God's own radical welcome of us, which is then reflected around the table in particular, the meal table. But of course extends far beyond that, since it is the purpose of the meal table of worship to ritualize, to represent a whole pattern of life together, of sharing power, of sharing goods, And that is what justification by faith is about, as a life of inheriting what God has promised as a gift. So I hope that reading Galatians now, not only with the skill you're developing at sort of tracking the development of an argument, but also the themes that we've begun to see as very prominent in Paul's teaching will help you to perhaps read Galatians with fresh eyes. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that unfolds this week. There's some similar teaching in Ephesians, of course, but Ephesians does have its own kind of music. And one of the key concepts that we're going to be considering in Ephesians is the way that the revelation of God in Christ relates to what you might call invisible superhuman powers. These powers can be understood as angelic, they can be understood as heavenly, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily good. It's a way of understanding the human as always being shaped according to powers that are not under human control, but nor are they necessarily God's power. Instead, they're mediating powers that are operative socially, psychologically, in the shape that human life takes. And so in Ephesians, Paul teaches the communities that he's writing to how it is that Jesus' ruling over these powers is to be reflected in the breakdown of certain walls, you might say, that have been erected both between human beings, between human communities, but also within a human person. And here there is an echo of the relationship between divisions between, say, Jews and Gentiles that Paul is addressing in Romans, as well as the division within a self. So this is a key concept, the heavenlies, heavenly powers, principalities and powers, they're sometimes called, in both Ephesians and Colossians. And I know that Ephesians might be something you're not able to give all the time you would like this week, but know that if you're able to really dive into Ephesians, this is going to be a really important sort of bit of Paul's teaching in that letter that is not easy, I don't think, for us to understand. And the video presentation, of course, tries to bring some clarity to. The key, again, is to see how Christ's rule over these powers and are even being seated with Christ in the heavenlies, Paul says, spills out into the bodily life that we're living together. So it's not just a theoretical thing or a way out there cosmic thing. It's also a very near social and personal thing that is the outworking, you might say, of the rule of Jesus in the world. Here comes Jude for a cameo. How you doing, Jude? Cool shark jammies, man. So that is one bit of Ephesians that I wanted to sort of alert you to. Another one is something that comes at the end of Ephesians. I mentioned this in the prompt. It's also something that I read to you about at the beginning of our treatment of Paul from Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, words of his grandmothers that he reports to us. And it's this part of Paul's teaching that is not in every letter of his, but is in several, that has been called household instruction or even household code. I don't really like the term code because I think that sort of attributes to this teaching something that is more rigid than it is, in fact. But it is instruction that is addressed specifically to people as their lives are shaped by household roles. Household roles being especially those of husband-wife, parent-children, and slave-master. Those are three kind of axes of relationship that constitute the pattern of household life. Now, it's important to remember when we get to this that when Paul says household, he doesn't mean what many of us have in our minds when we think of households, sort of post-industrialization, in societies like the one that many of us are living in the United States. And this is, of course, where households are, excuse me, they're places where what we now call the nuclear family lives. So often two partners that are married and children, but little more than that. And often these sorts of households are not places of economic production. They're places almost exclusively of economic consumption, because production takes place elsewhere. You leave home, you leave the household to go to work somewhere else, kind of thing. And that's a function of the socioeconomic order in which we find ourselves that has some things to commend it, and I think a lot of things also to lament. But in Paul's time, and in many places still today, the household is not a place of only economic consumption, but also economic production, where crafts and trades that larger sort of extended families cultivate are passed down across generations, where education will often take place. The production of food is typically a significant part of household life. But you can see how that might affect the dynamics of relationship when they're not just what we might think of today as sentimental bonds of relationship, but also economic bonds of relationship. And that these include not just a nuclear family in the households that Paul is addressing, but the extended family. So multiple generations, grandparents, great-grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and also slaves that would be part of the household, sometimes other relatives that we would think of as distant but are near in the household order. Anyway, this more extended concept of household is what Paul is addressing when he delivers these household instructions at the end of a letter like Ephesians. And as I suggested at the beginning of our treatment of Paul, these household instructions are highly problematic. They have proved the justification of truly horrifying subordination of human beings, whether through the institution of slavery, whether the subjugation of women, turning marriage into itself an institution of sexual slavery, for example. So I don't want to march into these household instructions lightly, and I just want to alert you to the difficulties involved. In the video presentation on Ephesians, which goes into some background from Aristotle on the household and things like that, I attempt to give you what I hope is some guide for interpreting these instructions, but they remain difficult. So I am happy for us to have any discussion about them that you'd like to have this week. No doubt in the field of psychology, you will be dealing with the fallout of what these sorts of instructions in Paul's letters have done to people, whether it's a certain problem with masculinity, what people have been shaped to assume it means to be a man, an overly rigid understanding of gender, the widespread misogyny that subordinates women and overly sexualizes their bodies, socioeconomic hierarchies that are still with us and attributable to the racialization of human society, especially in the West, etc., etc. These household instructions are not innocent. And so we want to read them carefully, critically, not rushing to vindicate them too quickly, but yes, trying to hear them in the flow of these letters, keeping in mind the sort of context that they seem to be addressing and allow that to inform how we're going to interpret them. I realize you have a full plate this week. You've got a book review on Seized by Truth by Joel Green. A really important book, I think, for our class as it deals with canon and especially how treating the Bible as a canon of Scripture affects its interpretation. It's a really good question for us to consider, and it involves in Professor Green's treatment something that I think we've already seen is prominent in our class, and that is the way that we don't come to the text of Scripture as kind of blank slates or people that have been unconditioned by our various influences in life. Instead, we all come to the text as shaped by a variety of traditions, cultural traditions, Christian traditions, and these are influencing how we hear the text to mean something and what we hear it to say. Sometimes this has been a threat to people's understanding of the Scripture's authority, so that the impulse is to minimize those influences. But I think you're going to see Dr. Green give us some helpful ways of thinking about how those influences are not really to be minimized as if we could get rid of them, but instead they are influences to be cultivated in a certain way, but also disciplined so that they can support a careful reading of the text, be open to correction, etc. So really great questions, I think, that the book treats, that I hope coming out of a two-course sequence for many of you, Old Testament and New Testament, will give you some good ideas to be working through about how you relate to the Bible, not just as a hodgepodge of documents, but as Scripture, and not as a book that has come to you to mean something apart from a variety of influences that we're trying to get rid of, but has been mediated by a whole variety of influences that we want to cultivate, but also discipline. So looking forward to your thoughts on that book. Make sure you pay attention to the assignment guide for that. Looking forward to the conversations this week by video in the forums, etc. Thanks again for all your hard work.